Hi, Acadiana. I'm Meteorologist Dave Baker. Happy Tuesday to you. Really pretty day here in Acadiana, but kind of hard to believe that the southeastern part of the state is seeing a completely different kind of day than what we have here. And some of that is thanks to the remnants of Rafael. Remember Rafael over the weekend that kind of fizzled out over the Gulf of Mexico? Yeah, there's some moisture that's there over southeastern Louisiana, kind of drifting its way backwards. And we're going to start to see some more clouds kind of rolling in here as we get into the afternoon. But that's also going to set the stage for kind of a rainy Wednesday as that gets sucked up into a bit of a short wave and a bit of a front that's going to be working through the area tomorrow. And eventually that will clear out, and I think we're going to see some really pretty conditions for the second half of the week. But then going into the weekend, we are going to be watching out for the possibility of another tropical system developing almost in the exact same place that Rafael did, and several other tropical systems so far this hurricane season. And the forecast track is very similar to what we were seeing to Rafael, possibly getting it into the Gulf of Mexico. After that, though, it looks like there's a really big trough that's going to start to push in, and that should, we're hoping, keep anything associated with what might be Sara a little bit farther off toward the east. But there is a chance we could see another landfalling tropical system somewhere along the Gulf Coast. Right now, it doesn't look very likely for us or points westward, but maybe one off toward the east. That would be the sixth storm to make landfall. That would tie a record for the number of landfalling tropical systems on the Gulf Coast in just one season. So we'll get to that in just a little bit. First of all, again, a really pretty day here in Lafayette. 80 degrees the current temperature, feels like 81, so the dew point and the humidity not really making much of an impact on your feels like temperature. Nice breeze out of the north at 12 miles per hour, and the pressure currently at 2994. But check it out. Over southeastern Louisiana, it's been gray and rainy all day, and their temperatures are several degrees cooler as well. Most of the rain that we're seeing so far has been in the offshore waters, at least the heavy stuff. But we've got some mist and drizzle over Lake Pontchartrain, and even along the I-10 corridor, and even here getting over toward Baton Rouge. So if you get on that Basin Bridge, it's going to be sunny in Henderson, but by the time you get to Baton Rouge, it's going to be gray and it's going to be kind of rainy, and that continues there. We're already starting to see some of those gray skies work their way into portions of St. Mary Parish this morning or this afternoon as well. And you can see this on the satellite imagery. You see those low clouds there over southeastern Louisiana, while the rest of the state is enjoying an absolutely gorgeous fall-like day. Now, we're still going to be on the warm side today with temperatures topping out around 80, but the farther east you live, some of that cloud cover as it rolls in is going to kind of limit those high temperatures, and that's why highs are expected to stay in the 60s there over the southeastern part of the state. And you can kind of see those that low cloud deck starting to emerge there on the horizon. The I-10 at Louisiana Avenue, the Breaux Bridge, the Henderson camera, all looking off toward the east. The I-49 I-10 one is also looking east. A little bit harder to see that low cloud deck, but you're going to see again sunshine when you get on the bridge at Henderson. But when you get to the other side of the bridge, it's going to be a very, very different story. Cloudy, cool, and even some drizzle out there. But that is what is going to be moving in. And at the same time, we've got a front coming in from the west. So the combination of the both should provide us with a gray, rainy, and possibly some heavy downpours going into Wednesday. So that's going to be your forecast coming up down the road. But you can see that little bit of a swirl that's still left. And there's kind of several little ripples of energy that are still associated with Rafael, kind of drifting off toward the west. So we're going to stay sunny most of the day, but getting into the afternoon, St. Landry, St. Martin, Iberia, St. Mary, or anywhere along the Atchafalaya Basin parishes, even over here into Lafayette, we'll probably catch those clouds starting to get in here a little bit later on this afternoon. Not a great boating day for the offshore waters, but compared to the past several days, it's actually pretty decent. Near shore waters, we're seeing seas running about 2 to 3 feet. Far offshore waters are 3 to 5, and then you get way out there, they're kind of building up to about 7 or so. So might be rolling again out there on some of the platforms, especially off the southeastern Louisiana coast, where we've got the cloudy skies and the gray conditions there. And as we look at the tropical Atlantic satellite as a whole, we've got a number of features that we're looking at here. And one is a frontal boundary that's kind of draped like that. And it kind of the tail end of that is there somewhere near Haiti and over to around Jamaica. So there's a little bit of a low pressure area or a bit of a tropical wave, a leftover tropical wave that's there. And that's what we're kind of watching right now, is that's going to kind of drift its way off toward the southwest. And then that Central American Gyre might start to kind of kick up as kind of ripples of energy kind of rotate around that. So that might help to intensify a new tropical system in this particular area sometime over the next several days, more likely toward the end of the week and the weekend. You got a couple of little tropical waves maybe moving here across the central part of the Atlantic, but not a whole lot to worry about there. And a series of cold fronts will be coming off the Atlantic coast here over the next several days. So a closer look at that little bit of a tropical wave or a low pressure area that's right about in here. Again, this is going to kind of drift off toward the southwest, and we'll have a better chance for some development there over the southwestern part of the Caribbean Sea. So if we get something to develop in here, the general track on some of our computer models is actually pushing it northward. Now, it possibly could affect areas of Cuba that were affected by Rafael just about a week ago. And there's also a couple of models that are indicating that this is going to emerge into the southeastern part of the Gulf of Mexico. And talking about that Central American Gyre, which is kind of a big, broad, low pressure area that spins over Central America during the early and latter part of the hurricane season. Again, you get kind of some ripples of energy that just kind of rotate their way around that. And sometimes it can stir something up here over the southwestern part of the Caribbean Sea. And that has been responsible for a number of tropical systems already this year, even a couple of big ones there. Helene was one that kind of started in that particular area. So we'll have to watch out for the possibility of something strengthening, especially over the northwestern part of the Caribbean Sea, where the waters are still warm and the tropical cyclone heat content is still quite high. So the National Hurricane Center has a medium chance that this could develop here within the next 2 days, but a high chance, better than 90% now, that we will get a tropical system to develop in that area by the time we reach the weekend or the early part of next week. So about 60% on the chance today or tomorrow, which doesn't look very likely, but as we go into the latter part of the week and the weekend, I think the conditions are going to be a lot more favorable, and therefore the National Hurricane Center has a 90% chance that we'll see another tropical system develop. So this would be our 18th, I believe, named storm. We've had 19 tropical systems, but one didn't get a name. So I think we've got, this would be number 18. And remember those early season forecasts that were calling for somewhere between 19 and 23? It's amazing how we're getting closer and closer to that range, because as we got into the latter part of July and when really things shut down with all the Saharan dust in the middle part of the summer, I really thought, man, these are going to be way off on the forecasts, but now we're starting to catch up. So some of the forecasts with these high numbers of tropical storms is probably going to verify. At least we're going to be right on the outside edge of some of those envelopes, those windows where we saw anywhere between 18 to 23, I think was kind of the range. So we're starting to get in there. So some of those early season forecasts are starting to verify. So let's go ahead and get into the different global models. We're going to go out the next 10 days, but you're quickly going to see that low pressure area develop there over the western part of the Caribbean, according to the GFS. So this is by Monday. Now we're Tuesday. Wednesday of next week, you might see that big trough coming in from the northwest, which would turn it northeastward. And I will tell you that most tropical systems that develop over the western part of the Caribbean generally would take a turn more toward the northeast. A lot of times they don't make their way up toward Florida. They just kind of cruise the way northeast across across Cuba and into the Bahamas. But it's a little more unusual to see these drifting into the Gulf of Mexico, especially with some of the numbers that I'm seeing on this particular model run. This is dropping. I believe the GFS has got this dropping down to about 942 on the millibars. That could be a Category 3 hurricane easily, and that would be the second major hurricane that could possibly move into the Gulf of Mexico during November, which is extremely unusual. Remember, Rafael became a major hurricane briefly as it hit that warm eddy of water there just north of the Yucatan. So if it can drift its way a little bit farther toward the west and it's got low amounts of wind shear, this could possibly verify, and we might be talking about yet another major hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. but steering its way off toward the northeast. But the GFS has a landfall now over Florida. And the last couple of runs have been central, South Florida, Florida Keys, maybe staying over around, over toward Cuba and the Bahamas. But if this were to make landfall in Florida, according to this, that would be the 6th named storm to hit the Gulf Coast during one hurricane season. So that would tie an all-time record. Euro model, this one's actually from a little bit earlier. We don't get the extended run until later this afternoon, but the morning model shows a festering low pressure area. And this is every 3 hours. The GFS is every 6. So why it seems like it runs a little bit slower, it really isn't. You're just seeing more frames in this. But notice how it also makes a run for that Yucatan channel, but then the trough that's coming in from the west looks to be coming in a little bit faster than what the GFS is indicating. So what you get is you get something to kind of stall here for a couple of days. And then once this trough starts to develop, it'll pick it up. But if it moves fast enough, it would curve it away and move it toward the Florida Keys and then maybe back over toward the Bahamas, which is what this early morning Euro model is indicating. So the Canadian model also has a fairly decent trough coming in, but on this particular model, it hugs the coast a little bit more and gets absorbed by that trough fairly quickly. So it doesn't have as much time to develop. So based on the Euro model and the GFS, they're both calling for hurricane, if not major hurricane, while the Canadian model keeps this closer to land, and it looks like kind of a low-end tropical storm, but based on the pressure, it should be able to get a name. The ICON, which again, the ICON, the GFS, as well as the Canadian models, all of these models finished just like within the last hour or so. So the ICON model has a festering storm there on the coast of Honduras and not much movement, and then kind of hovering over land. And then by the time that trough starts to work across the areas of of the Gulf Coast, it kind of pulls that remnant low pressure area up toward Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. But by that point in time, it's really not anything. So this would be more, I guess, on the far end of this forecast would be something like what you would have seen with Rafael. It would have been sheared apart, and it really wouldn't have been a whole lot of anything. But going out 10 days, it still has a tropical type of system here over the north part of the Gulf of Mexico. So we'll go through some of the, so you got a landfall here with the GFS. You've got kind of a scoot in between Florida and Cuba with the Euro. And then it looks like the Canadian model was also kind of trying to work its way onto the Florida coast, while the ICON model has something a little bit farther up toward the north. But we're just going to go out a week from today, because when you go out beyond 5 days, you've got a lot of differences. And you probably noticed, if you followed along with Rafael was pretty close on all of the models for the first 3 days. All the lines were on top of each other, and then they spread out all over the place for days 4, 5, 6, and 7. So the models are not as dependable in that extended forecast, especially as we start to get into November like this. So let's just go through the 4 of them. And again, this is going to stop this a week from today. So this is the GFS model, and the pressure on that is 946. So that is a deep tropical system. 946 is somewhere category 3, possibly borderline category 4. And then remember, the GFS had it curve and go toward Florida, the central part of Florida. The Euro model from earlier today also has a deep tropical system moving over those warm waters of the northwestern Gulf of Mexico that has high tropical cyclone heat content. 935 is where this bottoms out here a week from today. That would also be a category 3 or more likely a category 4 hurricane. But this model here kind of curves it more in that direction. It doesn't quite make it up toward Florida, might hit the Florida Keys, but it would be more of a threat to deep South Florida, Cuba, and portions of the Bahamas. Canadian model, again, is much weaker on the development as it kind of hugs the coast of Central America for a considerable amount of time. But at least on location a week from today, it's basically in the same place. I think the GFS was right about in here and the Euro was over here. So now you got the Canadian model that's really in the ballpark of the other two. But you can see the pressure here, 1001. That is considerably weaker. That would be a high-end tropical depression or a very low-end tropical storm. 1001 millibars could still get it a name. Now, the icon model, by the time we get a week from today, notice it's quite different than the other ones. You got a bit of a leftover low-pressure area kind of scooting its way toward the northern Gulf Coast, but starting to get caught in this trough, so it would turn off more toward the north and east like that. But it keeps it kind of over Central America for a number of days, and it doesn't really strengthen at all because it's over land. So the icon model is the weakest of the four, and it's also the only one that has a much weaker trough or a slower moving trough coming in from the west that would allow it to make more of a northerly track rather than turning it more toward the northeast. So these models are going to change, especially getting out beyond 7 days, but we're pretty certain we're going to have a tropical system in the western Caribbean, and about half of the models now, half to 3/4 of the models are calling for a tropical system to move into the Gulf of Mexico, and 2 of them right now are calling for a major hurricane, which is really just unbelievable as we've now moved into the middle part of November. Now, those water temperatures are quite high again, so anywhere in this western part of the Caribbean with the development with some low wind shear and those water temperatures at 30 degrees Celsius, which is 86 degrees on the Fahrenheit scale, that is way warm enough to be able to support a tropical system. And then notice as it tries to work through the Yucatan Channel here, those waters are equally as warm. And then you got kind of that bit of a loop current that's here over the central eastern part of the Gulf of Mexico. That's where Rafael kicked up to 120 there briefly and made it into a major hurricane. So if you can get Sara to move into this particular area with low wind shear, there's no reason to believe that we wouldn't see additional strengthening as it moved into the southern part of the Gulf of Mexico. And that tropical cyclone heat potential is quite high. And if you're not familiar with this doesn't only measure 80-degree water temperatures at the surface, but how deep that warm water goes. So we've got decent TCHP here in the southwestern part of the Caribbean, but in the direction that most of the models are pushing it would put it into that highest area of TCHP there, going through the Yucatan Channel, and you still have some decent warm waters here over the southern part of the Gulf of Mexico. So strengthening would be still fairly likely, or even maintaining the strength. But if it were to work up into this particular area, it's going to hit that colder water, and there's also going to be a lot of wind shear by next week, so it would tend to shear it apart. So right now I'm not really overly concerned about the western and central part of the northern Gulf Coast, but working your way over toward Florida, I know those folks are already hurricane weary from this season, and they're going to be watching this one very closely. So let's go ahead real quick and take a look at some of the shear models that are out there right now. And we've got low wind shear that's over the western part of the Caribbean Sea right now, and that is expected to stay that way for at least the next couple of days. But as we go into next week, you can see that lower wind shear extends into the southern part of the Gulf of Mexico. While it's quite high here along the Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama border, it does kind of work in tandem with the tropical system according to the GFS. And if it's got that low wind shear there over the extreme southeastern Gulf of Mexico, the waters are warm enough we could still see some slight strengthening in that particular region going on before it would turn and move its way off toward the northeast. So right now in the crosshairs, I think I would be concerned if I lived in central or southern Florida, definitely the Bahamas, western parts of Cuba, and even Jamaica needs to be watching out for this, because even though it's probably going to be a small, tightly wound system, very much like what some of our previous hurricanes were like. Oscar was one of those tiny ones. Even Rafael wasn't necessarily a huge type of a system. But I don't think it's going to be anything like a Milton that was very tiny and just whipped its way up to a Category 5 and nothing flat. But there's a chance we could see another major hurricane in parts of the Gulf of Mexico. And I'm going to have to go back in the record books and see what the record is for the number of major hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico during the month of November, because I don't remember really any of them. Eta back in 2020, I don't believe was a major hurricane when it reached the southern part of the Gulf of Mexico. It was a major hurricane over around the coast of Nicaragua, but after that, I think it weakened as it moved off toward the north. So that's one of those things I'm going to have to dig up to see if I can get that information for you by tomorrow. And also remember, the Global Tropics Hazard Outlook has been keeping the Western Caribbean and the Western Atlantic as kind of a hot spot here. Now, this is going to update later this afternoon, so I'll have the new map for you tomorrow, but for last week's version, it was still keeping things pretty exciting over the Western Caribbean and going into the following week as well. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens when we get the new update. And this has actually been a pretty valuable product. That week 3 was in the experimental mode, but this has been a pretty valuable product to be able to show that November was going to be increasingly busy. And with Rafael becoming a major hurricane and the possibility of Sara, and we're only at November the 12th, who's to say that we might work our way to Tony a little bit farther down the list? And if we get a Tony, then we're up to 19, and we're definitely in that range of the predictions that we got from the early part of the hurricane season. Of course, November, most of your hurricanes do develop in the western part of the Caribbean, and they do tend to turn more toward the northeast as those troughs become more progressive and we get some of these decent cold fronts to come in. And to tell you the truth, advertised by the Euro and the GFS, that trough that would pick up what might be Sara and cruise it off toward the east looks really significant. I was looking at some of the heights, and one of the things that we look for on the heights, it's the 500 millibar height. So when it's colder, that height is lower, and when it's warmer outside, that height is much higher. So in the summer, it's like 590, 594, it approaches 600, but that's a really, really hot day. But in the wintertime, 540 is what's considered the rain snow line. And you have to match that with some actual cold temperatures at the surface too. But some of those 500 millibar levels with the GFS being advertised are going down at 540, 534. Maybe I've seen a couple of 528s kind of roll in. So that would be a significantly cool air mass. Maybe we can have some highs in the 50s rather than just lows in the 50s. It'd be nice to finally get some holiday season type of weather. And Donnie, I'm not sure about a December hurricane, but it is something that has happened a number of times before. 2020, we had a couple of them that crossed over from November into December. I have to go back and look still to see how many have actually formed during the month of December, because we've had a few of them that actually form in November, but they're still alive rolling once the calendar page turns into December. But we've been talking about since about the mid part of September that, with La Nina making a slower appearance in the hurricane season, the thinking was that maybe we're going to be pretty bottom heavy on the amount of activity for the second half of the season. So Donnie, I wouldn't be surprised to see something still be around or perhaps even develop going into December. It's not something that never happens. It happens rarely, but it does happen. So it wouldn't be something that would be so out of the ordinary to have something that actually cruised into December. And I can actually show you that here. When you look at the frequency, of course, the peak of the hurricane season is September the 10th, and that's when you have everything. But if you look going into the end of November and going into December, some of that activity is almost about the same as what you would see going into July. So, and you do have tropical systems that actually go into January as well. We have had a tropical system, I believe, every single month of the season. I want to say except for maybe February, but don't quote me on that. But I'm pretty sure we've had tropical systems in every other month. Sometimes we get preseason ones, and sometimes we get postseason ones as well. But we're going to watch these models, and fortunately, I really don't think this is going to be any kind of a problem for us here in Louisiana. So it's going to be just exciting to be able to watch and see what happens. And this has been a very different kind of a hurricane season. We've seen a lot of new things. We've seen a lot of rare things happen, and it looks like that wants to continue. And hurricane season doesn't officially officially end until November the 30th. So it's going to be kind of exciting to see what else Mother Nature is going to throw at us when it comes to the 2024 hurricane season. Hopefully we don't have anybody have any problems, and especially Florida, because they've just taken on way too much this hurricane season. Well, that's what I've got for you on this Tuesday afternoon. Please like my video and subscribe to the channel, and also turn on those notifications. And don't forget, you can hear my local weather forecast daily on Big 102.1, Planet Radio 106.7, and Freedom 95.1. And any updates or changes in the models in between any of these broadcasts, you can get that information by following my social media pages, both on Facebook and X. I'm meteorologist Dave Baker. Have a great rest of your Tuesday, and I'll see you on a rainy Wednesday. Take care.